To make this backsplash, I'm going to be using this old oak flooring. It's only a little thicker than about a 1/4 inch thick. And I got it for free from one of my neighbors when they were replacing their floor. I went and tore it up and kept it. And this is just a little bit of it. I have a gigantic stack of it that I use for different projects. So the first thing I did with this was there was a coating on the top, and even though the back of this is what's going to be seen, I just roughly sanded the top of this so that when it comes time to stick it to that fiberglass, you won't have to worry about adhesion because you'll have a rough surface. Once that's sanded, I'm going to now rip off the tongue and the groove from the old flooring because I won't be using it. So now that I have that groove removed from one side, I could go through and rip off the tongue because I have a nice flat edge. And the tongue I'm going to remove at the same time as I cut this to the width I want. I've already done a couple of test pieces of this. This is the finished product that's coming out of this lumber. And the width of it is going to be about 1 5/8". Now you can make the width of yours whatever you want depending on your original stock. But in order to get rid of this tongue, I'm going to have to take it down to about 1 5/8". So this is what the pattern I'm making eventually looks like. So it's just a collection of these triangles. And this pattern originally came off of something someone sent us from Pinterest. And so it's not an original design or anything, but it's basically the tumbling block pattern. These parallelograms that you see a lot of times, they'll make them cutting boards out of them, and they're an optical illusion. It's called the tumbling block pattern. And then that is just split in half, and then it makes this almost like a flower type shape. So in order to get all these triangles, the top triangle is 60 degrees and the two sides are 30. So if you had a miter saw where your gauge went to 60 degrees, you could set it and chop all of these at 60, leaving you with a 30-degree angle. I don't have a miter gauge that goes to 60 degrees, so what I did was I took this scrap piece of plywood and I cut a 60-degree angle on it. So when I take my strips and put them on there, I'll cut off the edge, and you can see it'll cut this and leave 30 degrees, and then I'll flip it and cut another one, and it will cut these triangles. So with this jig set up, I could just keep going through and sliding and cutting all of these triangles. So these are the triangles I'm left with. They're all pretty much perfectly matched. And that's what will make my pattern. Now when you're cutting these, you could probably set up a clamp that will hold it in place, because the table saw, when you're cutting at an angle like that, it wants to pull it towards it, which it kind of does a little bit, and it would be safer to use a clamp. I might set that up down the line, but I'm just kind of making a test run this time around, so I'm not really going to go through the hassle of setting up a clamp. And the way I line this up is, the first cut is obviously simple. When I flip it, I line the point up to the edge of where that cut line is on my sled. So when I flip it, I line that point right up to the edge of this line and send it through, and that gives me a perfect cut every time. So with that stack of triangles cut, I started laying out a rough pattern using 5/16 tile spacers.
before I started laying this out, I kind of drew a rough 12-inch grid on that piece of plywood because that's the size mesh sheets I bought. And it wasn't until the end when I realized that I could set this up using a hexagon, which ended up working perfectly because they'll all fit into each other. With my pattern all lined up and set up, I wanted to replace those plastic spacers with a permanent pattern so I could recreate these tiles really quickly as soon as I cut a stack of the triangles. I had a piece of 1/2 inch MDF and I just cut it into 5/16 inch strips and just started removing the spacers and adding the MDF strips.
Bought this fiberglass mesh off Amazon. It's 12 by 12 pieces, and that's what I'm going to stick my wooden pattern onto in order to put it up on the wall. Now I'm trying, the jig is going to be great for lining everything up, but I'm trying to think of a way to get the pattern stuck to the mesh because that's sticky and I don't want the jig to stick to it. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to get something similar to what I use for the strips and fill in the space between here. Then I'm going to take a backer and glue a backer onto the entire jig so that it can be flipped over and the mesh can be laid on top of the wood, and then just the whole thing can be peeled off the jig. I think that's going to be the easiest way to do that. So before I do that, I'm just going to go through and make sure there's no gaps in my pattern and everything's lined up perfectly, because once you make this, they're all going to be identical to this.
Once the pattern was set, I just flipped it over and removed all the pieces using my X-Acto knife just to kind of loosen everything up and pop those triangles out.
So with this pattern dried up, I took all the pieces out and I think it's going to work great. There's two little changes I want to make to this before I could start producing these tiled patterns. And that is on the edges, I'm going to add a strip around all these 6 outside edges just to keep this in place for when I'm putting the pattern on so it can't move. And also, my spacers worked well, but they're a little bit too shallow. I want these actually to stick up above the pattern just a little bit so that that fiberglass mesh will only stick to the wooden blocks and not my pattern. So I'm going to go through and add another little spacer on top of all of these, and then this should be ready to start pumping out these tiles. So I only have 5 of these made. But you can see, since they're a hexagon, that they're going to fit together perfectly. And once they're together, you actually can't even really see the seams of where each one separates. Now, the thing to consider when doing this is, since this is reclaimed flooring, some of the thickness is a little different. Since I cut all this stuff by hand, there's going to be little differences at each part. The nice thing about that is, because these are being grouted and you have a grout line, there's a little more leeway in the pattern than if these were all flush together. You could kind of hide those little mistakes. And the nice thing about this sticky fiberglass mesh stuff is, if when push comes to shove during install, these will stick on there, but you can also rearrange them on the wall when it comes time for install. So I don't have an exact square footage on this space yet, so I don't really know how many more of these I have to make. But the install with this is not really happening anytime soon. So I'm probably just going to post this video of how to make it, and then you would install this just like you would regular grout tile. But then somewhere down the line I should have a video of installing this particular pattern.